Screencast is going to talk about how the respiratory system works. Specifically, it's going to go into detail into the 4 parts of the process known as respiration. You can go ahead and look at the description or the caption of this video and fast forward as needed to focus on different parts of this process. The primary functions of the respiratory system, though there are other functions, are to get oxygen into the body and then to get carbon dioxide out of the body. There are lots of other things that the respiratory system does, but this is going to be the focus within this screencast, specifically oxygen. So when we talk about the direction that gases move, we're going to take oxygen from our environment, bring it into the lungs, transfer it to the blood, and then transport that to the different body tissues that need it. This could be anything from muscles to the brain to the digestive system. Body tissues, as they carry on their metabolic functions, produce carbon dioxide. This builds up as a waste unless it's removed. So we're going to take carbon dioxide and push it in the opposite direction. It's going to go from the body tissues into the blood, where it's transported back to the lungs and breathed out into the environment. The cardiovascular and respiratory systems are very closely connected. They are closely connected in their role of transporting oxygen. So the respiratory system is going to get oxygen into the body and then into the bloodstream. The cardiovascular system is going to take over from there, transport oxygen around the rest of the body and to the tissues that need it. Again, carbon dioxide is going to go in the opposite direction. There are 4 parts to this process known as respiration. Ventilation is breathing air into or out of the lungs. External respiration is the gas exchange that occurs between the alveoli and the capillaries that surround them. So whether that's oxygen going into the blood or carbon dioxide going into the lungs. Gas transport is the cardiovascular system, circulating gases throughout the body as they are in the blood. And then internal respiration is going to occur between the capillaries and the body tissues. Before we go much further, I want to have a few science reminders that we're going to need as we talk about these processes. The first is diffusion. In diffusion, we're going to have molecules going from high concentration to low concentration down the concentration gradient. So you can see on the left side of this diagram, they're really built up. There are a lot of them, high concentration, and they are going to slowly move down to the right side, down the concentration gradient, so that they are evenly distributed, because they want to be evenly distributed. Now, we don't have pure gases when we're in our environment. We have a mixture. Our environment is about 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen, 1% other things, including carbon dioxide. Whether in that mixture or gases dissolved in liquid, each gas is going to account for part of the total pressure. This part of the pressure is called partial pressure. So at sea level, air pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury. Oxygen makes up about 21% of the mixture of our environment. And so 21% of 760 is 160 millimeters of mercury. So oxygen's partial pressure at sea level is about 160 millimeters of mercury. That's going to be important when we talk about the different processes, the different parts of the process of respiration. Partial pressure works on the same kind of concentration gradient as diffusion. The gases are going to want to go from an area of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. Again, we'll talk about that more later in the screencast. One last reminder is Boyle's law. Boyle's law states that pressure and volume of a gas have an inverse relationship. So you can see that inverse relationship in that diagram on the left, and then it's illustrated in the 2 pictures on the right. There are the same number of molecules in both of those pictures, whether that's this one or this one, but there's more volume in the picture on the left. When there's more volume, the molecules can spread out more, meaning there's less pressure. When there's less volume, the molecules are closer together, meaning there is more pressure. So as volume increases, pressure decreases. As volume decreases, pressure increases. This is going to be very important as we talk about ventilation. So the first step of respiration is ventilation. Ventilation is what we know of as breathing. We have inspiration and expiration, also called inhaling and exhaling. Ventilation is going to operate based on the atmospheric pressure inside the lungs compared to the atmosphere and the pressure gradient that's caused there. So again, air is going to want to go from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So that means in order to get air into our lungs, we're going to need to have an internal lung pressure that's lower than the atmosphere. When we want air to get out of our lungs to exhale, we need the pressure in the atmosphere to be lower than the pressure in our lungs. When we're not breathing, the pressure in the lungs is going to be equal to the pressure that's in the atmosphere. So how do we change the pressure in order to move air? We do it through changing volume. Remember that cause and effect are very important. So when we look at the picture on the left, we're going to increase the volume of our thoracic cavity, which is then going to decrease the pressure within our lungs and cause air to come into our lungs. In order to exhale, we do the opposite. We decrease the size of our thoracic cavity, and this decrease in volume is going to increase the pressure within our lungs and cause air to move out of the lungs. Cause and effect is very important. We do something that changes the volume, that changes the pressure, that makes air move in a given direction towards low pressure. So, as we said, ventilation is made up of inspiration and expiration. So let's talk about inspiration first, getting air into the body. The basic sequence of events is that the diaphragm is going to contract and move downward. So the diaphragm sits here up under the lungs within the rib cage. It's going to move downward. This is going to make the thoracic cavity bigger. The increase in volume is going to make the pressure in the lungs and the alveoli drop, and air is then going to come into the lungs because the pressure in the lungs is lower than the pressure in the atmosphere. You can see underneath the diagram for normal breaths, just sitting here, breathing normally like you probably are now, the pressure in the lungs only has to drop about 2 millimeters of mercury to make air come in. If we want a deeper breath, we're going to have to make a bigger space. So this basic sequence is all a part of it, but additionally, the external intercostal muscles, so the muscles on the outside of our rib cage, right between our ribs, but on the outside, are going to contract. This makes the rib cage expand further. It pulls the rib cage outward. The pressure in the lungs drops even more, and so even more air is going to come in. If we want a deepest breath, even more air to come in, we're going to have to increase the volume even more. So in this case, we may have additional muscles contracting, muscles in our neck or in our chest to further enlarge the thoracic cavity, to bring it upward and forward even more. Because the bigger the volume or the greater the volume, the lower the pressure is going to get and the more air is going to come in. So again, muscles move, whether that's the diaphragm, the intercostal muscles, or neck and chest muscles. Muscles move. This makes the thoracic volume greater, which makes the pressure within the lungs lower, which makes air move into them. Expiration is the opposite. So before we go on, remember pressure, volume. Take a second and just read that question and think about it. Hopefully you came up with something like this. The diaphragm is going to relax and move back upward to where it was. The intercostal muscles are going to relax. This is going to make the rib cage go back to its smaller resting position. The volume within the thoracic cavity then decreases. Doesn't have to decrease a whole lot, but it decreases, which makes the air pressure in the lungs increase, which makes air be pushed out towards the lower pressure that's now outside the body. So take a really long exhalation, like force all of the air you think you can out of your lungs. When you do that, what else do you feel contracting? Here, you're going to have your rib cage muscles, your internal intercostal muscles, so these are the muscles on the inside of your rib cage, contract and pull the ribs and sternum downward and inward to make that volume even smaller. Your abdominal muscles are going to contract, and together, all these things are going to result in an even smaller volume, which means even greater pressure, which means more air leaves your body. So again, this whole process of ventilation is you do something, whether consciously or unconsciously, to change the volume, which changes the pressure, which makes air move in the direction of lower pressure. One respiratory cycle is made up of one inspiration plus one expiration. So usually when we're counting the rate of respiration, we look at the respiratory cycle for 1 minute, and you just count each cycle. So you might just count on the inhale or just count on the exhale. It's really hard to do to yourself because you consciously start changing your breathing, but you can watch someone else do it. All right, so that was ventilation. Now we're going to talk about external respiration. As a reminder, the alveoli are microscopic air sacs within the lungs. They're these little things that look like grapes. They have a very large surface area, right? Much larger surface area than if our lungs were just two big balloons. Lots and lots of surface area. They are made up of very thin, simple squamous epithelial cells, and they're surrounded by a lot of capillaries. So you can see here that this capillary network goes really all around and kind of looks like they're in a net. So the respiratory membrane is the thin wall of the capillary plus the thin wall of the alveolus. And so you just have a double thick wall, but it's only two very thin cells thick. You have a basement membrane holding them together, but you can see it's a very thin membrane. Because it's thin, oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to be able to pass through more easily. So what is actually happening? You have these capillaries all wrapped around, so they would be all squiggly wrapped around, but it's just easier to see in the diagram if we just put it next to it. And so what happens is you have deoxygenated blood that's carrying carbon dioxide at the same time. Your deoxygenated blood is coming from the body. It went to the right side of the heart. It went out the pulmonary artery into the other smaller arteries until it eventually got to the capillaries around the alveoli. And so the deoxygenated blood comes in. As it comes into contact with this area, the oxygen is going to diffuse inward. Because there's no oxygen in the blood here, but there is a lot of oxygen in the alveoli, the oxygen is going to move from the area of higher partial pressure to the area of lower partial pressure. So oxygen is going to come in until the pressures are equal, and then there won't be any more diffusion. Once the blood is full of oxygen, the oxygen-rich blood will then go back to the heart via the pulmonary vein. So it'll go to the left side of the heart, out the aorta, and be distributed to the body so that the body has oxygen. Carbon dioxide does the opposite. There's a lot of carbon dioxide here because we just came from the body. And so there's less carbon dioxide in the alveoli. As it passes through, the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out. Again, it's going to go from areas of high partial pressure to low partial pressure. So when you look at the numbers here, remember that the atmospheric partial pressure of oxygen at sea level was about 160 millimeters of mercury. By the time it gets into the alveoli, it's only 104. So it goes from 160, easily goes into the area of lower pressure, whereas 104, and then goes into an area of even lower partial pressure, which is here, 40 millimeters of mercury within the blood. So you can see when the blood comes into the lungs, it's at about 40 millimeters of mercury. As the oxygen then diffuses across this respiratory membrane, it eventually evens out so that the partial pressure of oxygen within the capillary is equal to the partial pressure of oxygen within the alveolus. And so then it continues along on its merry way back to the heart to go to the rest of the body. The problem with altitude is that, say, on the top of Everest, the the atmospheric pressure is only 228 millimeters of mercury, which means the partial pressure of oxygen outside the body is only 45 millimeters of mercury. By the time it gets into the lungs, it's even lower, and so it can't diffuse into the capillaries because the concentration gradient is gone. And so we'll talk about that more when we can talk about altitude totally separately, but it's important to remember that this gradient needs to remain intact so that oxygen can move from the atmosphere into the lungs, into the lowest area of partial pressure, which is the capillaries. So that was ventilation, breathing in and out. External respiration, getting the oxygen from the lungs into the blood and getting carbon dioxide from the blood back into the lungs. Now we have gas transport. Gas transport is done by the cardiovascular system. We have other screencasts on the cardiovascular system, so you can go ahead and look at those for how that happens, but just know gas transport is the cardiovascular system transporting the gases throughout the body. Internal respiration is our last step in this direction. Internal respiration is very similar to external respiration, but it's going to occur in a different place and the opposite direction. So oxygen is going to go from the blood, where it has a high concentration or partial pressure, into the body tissues where it's lower. Carbon dioxide is going to go from the body tissues where it's higher because that's where it was made as a byproduct of cellular processes. And then it's going to go diffuse into the blood where it's low. So this is internal respiration. So again, ventilation gets air into and out of the lungs. External respiration is the transfer of gases between the lungs and the blood. Gas transport is circulation of blood throughout the body, and internal respiration is the transfer of gases between the blood and body tissues. So if we're talking about oxygen, inhalation brings oxygen into the body. External respiration then transfers that oxygen into the blood. The cardiovascular system then transports that oxygen throughout the body, where through internal respiration, it can diffuse into the cellular tissues, or the tissues of different cells throughout our body. Carbon dioxide will go in the opposite direction. It's created as a metabolic waste within the body tissues. Again, that could be brain, digestive system, muscles, anything. It then, through internal respiration, gets back into the blood, transported by the cardiovascular system around the body, through the heart, back to the lungs, where through external respiration, it diffuses into the lungs, and through ventilation is exhaled. So that is the process of respiration.